someone just told you that you were incredible. Maybe it was a performance. Maybe it was a piece of work you handed in. Maybe it was something you said in a room full of people who were listening. And in the moment after they said it, before you could stop yourself, something inside you immediately started looking for the holes. You made 3 mistakes. You forgot a line. You got lucky. They're just being nice. They didn't see the parts you hid. You can think of 10 reasons they're wrong before you can think of 1 reason they might be right. And this is strange, because positive information about yourself should feel good. It should land cleanly, settle comfortably, and stay. Instead, it hits something hard inside the chest, slides off, and disappears before you can quite hold on to it. So why does the brain treat a compliment like a threat? Why does praise, the thing every human nervous system is supposed to want, feel so much harder to hold than criticism, which the nervous system is supposed to resist? The answer reaches back further than you'd expect, into the deep structure of how human brains were built to operate inside the kind of world that no longer exists. To understand why compliments feel dangerous, you have to understand what it meant to be exceptional in the world your brain was built for. Your ancestors lived in camps of roughly 150 people. Everyone knew everyone. Reputations were shared, updated constantly, and acted upon every single day. And inside those camps, standing out too far from the group was genuinely dangerous. The anthropologist Richard Lee documented this in extraordinary detail among the Kung San of the Kalahari Desert. When a hunter brought home a spectacular kill, the camp did not celebrate. They criticized. They said the animal was small. They said the meat would be tough. The bigger the kill, the harder the mockery. This was not cruelty. It was a deliberate social mechanism designed to keep any single individual from feeling elevated above the rest of the group. Lee called it talking the kill down. The Kung called it the way things work. Because in a small camp where survival depended on cooperation, a person who felt too exceptional was a threat to the whole group's stability. The tall poppy did not just get cut down socially. In the most extreme cases, a person who became too dominant, too self-elevated, too unwilling to share and cooperate could be excluded from the camp entirely. And exclusion in the Paleolithic was not a social inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Your brain remembers this, not consciously, not in words, but the circuits that process sudden social elevation, being singled out as exceptional, being separated from the group by praise, those circuits are still wired the way they were when standing out too far had real consequences. A compliment to your ancient brain is not just a warm observation. It is a signal that you have been seen as different, and being seen as different for 300,000 years was something to be managed carefully, not celebrated openly. This is why the first response is often deflection, not because you are broken, because some very old part of you is trying to level yourself back down before the group does it for you. Now, layer on top of this something researchers have been documenting for decades. The brain is not a fair judge of incoming information. It never has been. In 2001, psychologist Roy Baumeister published a landmark paper with a title that says everything: Bad is stronger than good. Baumeister and his colleagues reviewed hundreds of studies across multiple domains and found that negative information consistently receives more cognitive processing, more attention, more memory encoding, and more behavioral impact than positive information of equal intensity. One harsh criticism does more damage to a person's self-perception than one strong compliment can repair. A bad event is processed with more neural activity than a good event of equivalent magnitude. The brain simply weights negative information more heavily than positive information by design, because in a world where threats were real and consequences were immediate, it was far more costly to miss a danger than to overlook an opportunity. A missed threat could kill you. A missed compliment had no survival cost at all. So the brain evolved to pay more attention to things that might hurt you than things that help you, and it never fully stopped. This means that when a compliment arrives at the same moment as a self-critical thought, that self-critical thought almost always wins the processing competition, not because it's more accurate, because the brain was built to give it more weight. You are not unusually self-critical. You are running standard-issue human cognitive equipment, optimized for a world where bad news needed to be taken seriously and good news could afford to wait. But there is a third layer underneath all of this, and this one is where it gets truly strange. In the 1980s, psychologist William Swann at the University of Texas ran a series of experiments that produced results nobody quite expected. He gave people either positive or negative feedback about themselves, and then measured which kind of feedback they actually preferred to receive. The finding should not have worked the way it did. People with low self-esteem didn't just accept negative feedback more easily, they actively preferred it. They sought it out. They felt more comfortable receiving information that confirmed their existing self-image, even when that self-image was negative, than they did receiving information that contradicted it, even when the contradicting information was positive. Swann called this self-verification theory. The brain, it turns out, does not primarily want to feel good about itself. It wants to feel consistent. It wants the world outside to match the story inside. And if the story inside says, "I am ordinary," or "I am flawed," or "I am not the kind of person who gets praised for this," then a compliment is not just uncomfortable, it is threatening to the entire architecture of how you understand yourself. Accepting the compliment would mean updating the story. And updating the story is not a small task. It requires restructuring a whole set of downstream beliefs, behaviors, and expectations that you have built on top of the existing version of who you are. It's easier, in the short term, to reject the compliment and keep the story intact. This is not modesty. This is the brain performing an act of self-preservation. The self-image is a structure. A compliment is information that suggests the structure might need to change, and changing a structure from the inside is difficult, uncertain, and disorienting. So the brain, by default, chooses not to. There is also something happening at a neurological level that makes this even harder to override than it sounds. When a compliment arrives, the brain doesn't just evaluate its content, it compares it to a prediction. Neuroscientists call this a prediction error. Your brain runs a continuous model of the world that is about to do based on everything it already believes. When what actually happens matches the prediction, the brain registers this quietly and moves on. When what actually happens violates the prediction, the brain flags it as something that needs to be explained. If your stored model of yourself says you are ordinary, a sincere compliment creates a prediction error. The brain did not expect this. It doesn't know what to do with it. And the fastest resolution to a prediction error is to find a reason why the unexpected input is actually wrong. So the brain immediately generates alternate explanations. They're being kind. They didn't see everything. Anyone could have done this. It was just luck. Each of these explanations resolves the prediction error without requiring the self-model to update. The discomfort disappears. The compliment disappears with it, and the stored model of yourself stays exactly as it was. This is not weakness, this is efficiency. The brain is doing exactly what it was built to do, resolving uncertainty as quickly as possible with the least possible disruption to the existing model. The cost is invisible, the compliment is gone, the self-image is unchanged, and you feel briefly like you have been appropriately modest. And then there's something worth noting before we go further. This pattern is not a universal pattern across all cultures in the same way. Psychologist Hazel Marcus at Stanford spent decades studying how different cultural frameworks shape the way people relate to the self. In cultures that emphasize individual identity and achievement, she found that people tend to carry a more independent self-concept, one that sees the self as a fixed, bounded entity with stable traits that can be accurately assessed by outsiders. In cultures that emphasize collective identity and harmony, people tend to carry a more interdependent self-concept, one where the self is understood largely in relation to others and shifts depending on context. This matters for compliments because an independent self-concept creates a specific kind of vulnerability. If the self is a fixed thing with real measurable traits, then a compliment is either accurate or inaccurate. It can be verified or disproven. And a person with a low self-assessment has strong internal evidence that the compliment is wrong. In cultures with more interdependent self-concepts, the anxiety around compliments often takes a different shape. The concern is less, is this accurate about me, and more, does accepting this separate me from the group?
Different mechanism, same deflection, different flavor of discomfort underneath. What this tells us is that the difficulty with compliments is not a simple character flaw that some people have and others don't. It is a predictable output of how any brain navigating social belonging and self-knowledge processes information that challenges what it already believes. And then there is the imposter layer. Psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes first described imposter syndrome in 1978, studying high-achieving women who attributed their successes to luck, timing, and the failure of others to detect their true incompetence. Subsequent research expanded the finding far beyond a single demographic. Surveys of academics, executives, surgeons, engineers, and creative professionals have consistently found that the people most likely to dismiss their own accomplishments are often the ones who have achieved the most. This seems backwards. It isn't. The more a person has achieved, the more they understand the gap between what they know and what there is to know. Genuine expertise produces genuine humility about its own limits. A beginning musician has no idea how much they don't know. An expert musician knows exactly how far short of perfect they consistently fall. So when the expert receives a compliment on their performance, they're measuring it against a standard so high, so internally exacting, that the praise lands nowhere near the target they were aiming for. The compliment is for a performance the expert already knows was imperfect, and accepting it feels dishonest, not modest. The problem is that this standard is internal and invisible. The person giving the compliment is measuring against a completely different scale. They're telling you what the experience felt like to them. They are not grading your technique. They're reporting what happened inside them when they encountered what you made. And those are two completely different things, neither of which cancels the other out. But here is the deepest problem with all of this. When you deflect a compliment, you are not just protecting your self-image, you are also refusing the relationship the other person is trying to offer you. A compliment is not just feedback, it is a bid for connection, a bid for recognition, a bid for shared reality. When someone says, "That was remarkable," they're not submitting a performance review. They're saying, "I saw you. What you did moved something in me. I want you to know that." And when the response is, "No, not really, I made mistakes," the bid is rejected. Not intentionally, not unkindly, but the message received on the other side is often, "What I experienced must be wrong. What I felt was not valid." This is partly why giving compliments to people who deflect them feels so exhausting over time, not because the giver needs the compliment returned, but because the rejection lands as a small signal that their inner experience of your work does not count. Researcher John Gottman, who spent decades studying the dynamics of close relationships, found that the ratio of positive to negative interactions between people was one of the strongest predictors of relationship quality and stability. The ability to receive positive bids from the people around you is not a luxury, it is infrastructure. It shapes how safe people feel bringing their real reactions to you over time. There is also a longer-term cost that accumulates quietly. When the people around you learn that compliments will be deflected, they stop giving them. Not out of cruelty, out of efficiency. If every sincere expression of admiration is met with a list of corrections, the effort of giving it starts to feel like losing something. The person who deflects consistently often describes themselves as someone who doesn't need external validation. This is sometimes true, but it is also sometimes a defense positioned so seamlessly that it has become invisible to the person behind it. The result, over years, is an environment increasingly stripped of the small moments of genuine recognition that make close relationships feel like something worth being inside. Not because anyone chose this outcome, but because the brain's reflex to protect itself ran quietly long enough to slowly reshape the landscape around it. So what actually happens when someone does manage to accept a compliment? Not to perform accepting it, not to say thank you while still internally cataloging the flaws, but to actually receive it, to let it land, to allow the possibility that the other person saw something real. What has to happen first is something psychologists call cognitive updating. The self-image has to open slightly. A small window has to appear in the structure that says, maybe this version of me that I've been carrying around is not the only accurate version. Maybe the person in front of me has access to real information about who I am that I do not have direct access to myself. This is genuinely hard, not because people are weak, because the self-image is one of the most defended structures in the human brain. It has to be. A person with no stable self-image cannot function, cannot make decisions, cannot navigate a world that constantly asks them to know what they value and who they are. But a self-image that is defended so completely that no new information can enter it is a prison dressed up as a personality. The starting point, researchers suggest, is not to try to believe the compliment immediately. That's asking too much of a structure that was not built to update quickly. The starting point is simply to pause before the deflection, to notice that the deflection is happening, to say out loud or internally, "Thank you," and then to stop. Not to argue, not to agree completely, just to stop the automatic rejection long enough for the information to exist in the room for a moment longer than it usually does. The Kung San had a system for this. They talked the kill down, not to destroy the hunter, but to ensure no single person rose so far above the group that cooperation became impossible. The mechanism was social and external. Yours is internal and invisible, but it is doing the same job. It is keeping you from rising too far above the version of yourself you already know. The question is whether that version is still the right one, and the only way to find out is to let a little of the outside world in, one compliment at a time, one paused deflection at a time, one moment of simply saying thank you and meaning it even slightly more than you did the time before. You don't have to believe it completely, you just have to stop being so certain it's wrong.